Hello, hello. It's your favorite pale ass liberal making another video. Today I want to talk about Dark Matter 25's video of Fuck Around and Find Out, FAFO. I know that the Amazing Atheist already has made a response to this, but I wanted to throw in my 2 cents, and I think the title of this video is really going to kind of show the direction, but I don't think you're really going to understand what I'm going to say until I kind of get to that point. I don't want to do a shot for shot response to Dark Matter's video. Um, I think there's just a couple of things that he said that I want to break down, and I think I want to communicate my thoughts behind why I think what he said is flawed when it comes to criminal justice, and why I think a lot of leftist ideals tend to fall short. Um, this coming from one of the most leftist people that, at least in my community, I consider myself to be a very leftist person. I'm very extreme in some circumstances where I'm pretty okay with protests and even in some cases violent protests. So I think I don't really have to. I think I don't have to do anything to like make up for the fact that I'm criticizing a leftist ideal. However, I do think that Dark Matter does miss a couple of points, and I think there's a couple of things that, at least thoughts that I have, that I could very well be wrong about. But as somebody who worked in jails with law enforcement officers who worked who got a post certification where you essentially go through the criminal justice portion of a criminal justice degree without actually getting the degree itself, and somebody who understands things like use of force and criminal sentencing and a lot of that stuff, I think I can offer a better opinion than the normal commentator when it comes to these types of things. To briefly summarize a couple of points, he talks about um, how punishment is. He essentially prefaces the video by saying that punishment is what causes so much crime. He also kind of goes into a story where he accidentally stole a candy bar when he was a child, and his dad found out and overreacted and beat the shit out of him and made him return it, and how it made him very scared of his dad, and how that incited some sort of a kleptomania. I would like to basically say that he kind of weirdly says that this taught him to steal. Um, I'm not really sure if that's an appropriate way of describing it. Dark Matter himself has made a video before, which I cannot for the life of me remember which one it is, but it is a relatively recent one in the past year or so, where it was more of his just him talking into the camera like I'm doing now. But he did talk about how people tend to reframe their memories from when they're younger to make more sense of it now as an adult, and how a lot of times people have a lot of misconceptions about their childhood memories. I think maybe that has to be happening a little bit here because a lot of times, especially in circumstances like that, I don't know if the word lesson is the best and most appropriate use for this word. Maybe some sort of excitement. A lot of kleptomania doesn't necessarily come from, oh, I've learned to steal. I think it's very weird to say that you've learned to commit crimes. I think that's a very oversimplistic way of viewing it. I think a lot of psychologists would at least agree with me or appreciate a little bit when I say that, there's a sort of excitement, there's maybe sort of a normal behavior to steal when you're a kid, and also that wondering if you're going to get caught tends to be a lot of people's motivation. People do bad things because sometimes doing bad things feels good, and maybe that reaction as a kid could have incited that. But again, I don't want to put words in Dark Matter's mouth. I don't want to say that diminish his experience or anything, but maybe he is slightly remembering it in a different way to make it to where there might not have been another emotional reason why he did so. He talks about this in the element of fear, and I'm going to talk about this later for some other points that he makes. But the element of fear does kind of make it, especially when you're a kid. It's normal for a lot of children to kind of test boundaries, and so like, what can I get away with is a thing that a lot of children naturally do. And saying that he learned a better lesson when he was older, when his dad was felt ashamed for him rather than extremely punished him. Maybe his brain was a little bit more developed. Maybe he wasn't in the state where he had that same excitement out of it. Maybe it was a sort of compassion for the pain that he caused his dad upon his dad realizing that he stole some things. It could be multifaceted why he stopped stealing, and I think it's a little bit simplistic to simply say, "Oh, it was my dad's reaction, and maybe he accidentally stumbled onto it." It could be a number of things. And again, I don't want to diminish his feelings behind it. I don't want to say that it wasn't a good story because it was a really good story. But I do think that it doesn't really appreciate the reasons why people commit crimes sometimes. And part of me suspects that, especially with the framing of the video, you kind of have to frame things in a way to kind of point towards your thesis. And because I believe that anything can be framed almost any way that you want to, that will come up again later. That might be why it was kind of framed that way. Maybe not intentionally so, but maybe just as you have a thought pattern and you're thinking about other things, it's a natural thing for people to do when you have a train of thought. He also kind of says another preface to his ideology where he says, learning is proactive and punishment is reactive. And then he kind of talks about the psychology of watching people suffer, watching people do stupid things online and seeing them have some sort of like an instant karma, and how that can feel very satisfying, and how says he felt a very similar feeling. Uh, and that, he kind of akins it to eating donuts, how it can feel good, but it's actually bad for you. He brings in Jesus when talking about this, when he says, that Jesus was kind of telling you to ignore pain and like to go the extra mile and all sorts of things like that. If you want to watch the original video, I will original video. I don't want to shot for shot recap it. I just kind of want to talk about things that I feel like are relevant, as well as appropriately address what the video is about without just repeating exactly what he's saying, just kind of summarizing it. There's a couple of things that I do want to preface my opinion about what uh, Dark Matter says in this topic. For one, um, he already admits, kind of in the beginning of the video, that punishment and the way his dad reacted to him stealing, that kind of prevented him from stealing, was appropriate for him, but may not be appropriate for everybody. I think that is one of the more nuanced takes that he has taken, is that we do have a very standardized response to a lot of crimes that can have varying effects depending on the type of person. That will kind of be, I'll bring that up again later if I remember. However, I do want to say that, a little bit of punishment isn't necessarily a sort of suffering. The way that I would want to kind of preface this is by saying, if I were to throw you in prison for the rest of your life, obviously that's a punishment. And it's very easy to have a sort of problem with this punishment. However, so are speeding tickets. Some punishments are relatively minor to kind of de incentivize certain actions, and it's kind of why we have those things kind of put in place, even if they don't necessarily work. Again, I know it's not considered to be a violent crime and it's not really relevant, but I kind of want to show this on a scale of like there is a nice range of bad things, and there's certain types of punishments that while there might be a little bit of catharsis, and while there might not necessarily be that much of an improvement on society by imposing them, it isn't necessarily something that people disagree with. And for the most part, reasonable fines for average incomes, I think, are things that most people can agree with. If you're caught speeding, I don't think most people have a problem with you paying a $50 to $100 ticket, especially if your speeding is pretty egregious. The initial reaction that I saw to Dark Matter's kind of solutions to crime is kind of very similar to what TJ from The Amazing Atheist said, where it sounds very much like you're promoting punishment, and you're kind of just describing the same exact thing that we already do. That is kind of the main thing that I want to be understood, is that a lot of what is being said in this video, a lot of people already believe about our current system. And while, yes, you can find a lot of people in our politics who want to talk about religious punishment, divine punishment, biblical punishment, you have some people that are tough on crime. You also have a lot of focus on rehabilitation. A lot of times when you ask police officers, or when you ask politicians, or when you ask people who are pro cop or pro criminal justice or things like that, they will tell you that it is for rehabilitation and not necessarily for punishment. A lot of the time, some of them are a little bit more vindictive, but you do get a varying response, especially as public image starts to matter more. You can't, even if you believe in punishment, you can't necessarily say that it's for punishment or that you want to get the bad guys and punish them and make them and put them down. It's about damage control and rehabilitation is the main focus of messaging for these things. I want to preface this by saying, punishment is fine for most people in most circumstances that are reasonable, especially as you kind of consider the possibility that sometimes lessons do need to be taught a little bit hard. A lot of times people do things that they know they shouldn't do, but the reason why they do it is because they think they can get away with it. The moment you get caught, a lot of times for a lot of people can reframe whether or not you should be doing that thing. A lot of your people that keep going in and out of prison over and over again, they're not people who beat the shit out of somebody and they go outside and they immediately beat the shit out of somebody again. Even murderers, for that matter, very rarely do murderers murder somebody and then get released and murder somebody again. A lot of times in those circumstances, people are put under some sort of great personal stress in which they do have an extreme emotional response. Most of your repeat offenders are drug addicts, and it's the war on drugs that kind of caused this sort of endless cycle of people going in and out of jail, and the probation and parole programs that are a little bit incentivized, especially misdemeanor probation, are incentivized on relocking people up again because they do have that financial incentive. Dark Matter says that you should right wrong. Criminal justice is righting wrongs and not causing suffering. But my question to you is, how do you right wrongs without causing suffering? If you watch the movie Double Jeopardy, there's a very common thing that is disproven in that movie that I had to explain to a lot of people when I worked in a jail. And that was when people tried to ask her what was it like in jail, and she said she was in prison, and jail and prison are two different things. And I think she even went so far as to say that to accurately describe that jail is pre-trial, and people serving sentences that are a year or less, and prison is post-trial and people serving one or more years. Basically, one is mainly misdemeanors or people awaiting to go to court, and the other is mainly felonies or people who have already gone to court and been found guilty. A lot of times when you get arrested, you go to jail and you're essentially supposed to be waiting for court. And due to our overstressed court system and the way that our court system works, it is most certainly a punishment. If you look at it on paper and you have it described to you, it seems to be a sort of necessary part of the process. And the problem isn't that it is a punishment, but that everything surrounding it makes it into a punishment. The perfect example of this is the way that arrests kind of happen. So he also kind of, I'm going to circle back a little bit and kind of go back and forth between points, but he talks about criminal justice being reactive and not proactive. And I get it. What he's essentially getting at is if you can put more money into the community, you're going to prevent future crimes and blah blah blah. The socialism messaging that I mostly agree with. However, I think it kind of misses the point. Part of the reason why criminal justice is so reactive is because of that pesky thing called your Bill of Rights in your Constitution. You have constitutional rights. The Fourth Amendment alone, unwarranted search and seizures. The Eighth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment. The 14th Amendment, I can't remember what it exactly says off the top of my head, but it was what was mainly used for law enforcement. I have to look it up later. These are kind of the bedrock of our criminal justice system. And it's kind of why when a police officer arrests somebody, it's supposed to be established probable cause, defined as facts and circumstances that will lead a reasonable/prudent person to believe that a crime is being or has been committed. All of this to say that it is the presumption of innocence until proven guilty that makes it to where a bad action kind of has to be responded to. You have to enable a little bit of reactivity and that kind of risk for public safety. That really bad argument that's kind of used by Second Amendment advocates is actually a pretty good argument for a criminal justice system. You are innocent until proven guilty. There should be probable cause for things like your arrest or your warrants. If your house is going to be searched, there should be a really good reason. If you want to learn about the misuse of criminal justice, you can look at the Afroman case and other various cases about criminal warrants being served, or how that kind of tends to play out whenever there's not really good probable cause. And again, we live in a very big country. One area of your law enforcement jail prison structure is going to be very different from another area. Arizona might be a more applicable to what dark matter is talking about versus a more well-funded place like where I currently live, where the population of the jail is like below 500, and most of the people that are going to be there are usually drug addicts. A lot of the punishment that comes from our criminal justice system comes more from the fact of how arbitrary the law can be, how easy it is that you can actually get arrested, how provable the crime is. That's another thing that's really big. If an officer can't prove, or there's no real way to show or demonstrate that a crime has been committed, especially if the officer isn't really trained, how can you arrest somebody or prove a sort of guilt? This is the bedrock of our criminal justice system, as well as any sort of strain on the system itself, and or delays, and or other things that you have to deal with that just aren't commonly mentioned. When you go to jail, you have to follow rules. If you don't follow rules, you will get administrative punishment, which is not the same thing as criminal punishment. And the reason why it is not the same thing is because if it were a criminal punishment, then you're kind of getting into some really awkward territory. But also, it's basically a sort of, I guess the best way to phrase it would be privileges being taken away. And that's essentially what it's viewed as. You're arrested for committing a crime, your privileges are taken away. If you're in jail and you're not following the rules, your privileges are taken away. And then any excessive force or any force that's used on you is inherent and throughout the process, that you will either obey, or force can and will be used against you, which is kind of the nature of our law enforcement, is to gain control through force, which isn't always necessarily a bad thing. It's just when the law enforcement has so much benefit of the doubt that misuse of that power is kind of offered, and the various laws that surround that make it really, really easy to justify force. And I got kind of going back to prison culture, which is another thing that he mentioned. He very simplistically describes it as, you learn how to be a criminal from other criminals. Yes and no. It is bad conditions in prisons, as well as a sort of violent prison culture, as well as a lack of staffing, as well as kind of gang culture, and a sort of things diverting to the most violent and scary person controlling how things work. Um, that kind of creates this sort of culture. Again, there's a reason why you can go to one place and it's perfectly fine, and at most you're bored. Uh, you might have a little bit of worry about getting into a fight in these jails, or if you're not listening to the officers, they might be allowed to use force on you, and everything might be recorded. And then you go to another area where that jail is not really funded, or any funding goes to other things because of corruption. Uh, how you might have the inmates essentially running the jail a little bit more, in which case it's just kind of like the scariest person is running things, and you kind of have to be on your toes a little bit. Anybody that has even watched prison media, for that matter, will be able to tell you, like, there's that misconception of when you go to prison, find the biggest guy and beat the shit out of him to prove your dominance against everybody else. While not necessarily 100% true, that does kind of indicate the reason why prison culture is the way it is. It is the fact that both violent and non-violent people are thrown in there, and some of them have very severe personality disorders that do need to be separated, but can't really legally be separated for a couple complex reasons that I'm not going to get into now. When you have that mixing, as well as the gang culture that kind of goes into it, essentially out of fear, people are trying to establish a sort of control, um, a sort of dominance against others, a sort of established norm to prevent violence from being provoked onto them, or to be the most violent person in the room, or the scariest people in the room, and other people just trying to navigate that. Even in my small jail that I worked at, there were a couple of people who, when they were really scared at first, tried to make a shank, or they would try to have some sort of an extreme response, or they would try to be this like super ridiculous tough guy, especially the younger kids that would get arrested. They would try to project this sort of like ridiculous toughness, or You're trying to be the one that's working out the most to show other people not to mess with you kind of thing. This isn't a sort of, oh, I'm going to teach you how to be a criminal. It's a fight or flight response, and it's a culture that is often reinforced by lack of staffing and the sort of criminal justice mentality that Dark Matter's talking about so much. Putting people with scary people makes people act more scary. This does not necessarily help with dealing with violent individuals, nor does it help to oversimplify the dynamics of the criminal justice system, the way that the law is supposed to work versus the way the law actually works, how things are on paper versus in practice, and how things can be framed. I can't tell you the amount of times a 17-year-old kid went to jail and they didn't realize that they were allowed to go to jail because they thought you had to be 18 when in fact you only have to be 17 years old. And they go to a normal housing unit or they end up around other people or even an 18-year-old kid or a 19-year-old kid. And at first they're really scared. And yes, because the other inmates are bored, they'll fuck with them and they'll act even more scary than they actually are. And then when things calm down a little bit, they'll have some really, really honest conversations. And the more experienced inmates will even tell them, like, hey, you have an opportunity to, like, not screw up your life and not keep coming back here. Don't idolize this place and don't keep coming back here. There is a stark difference between that community of people versus a community of people a couple of cities away from me where their funding isn't as good. And normal gang violence outside on the streets is very common, and thus, when you get arrested, even for a drug crime, you are going to be surrounded by gang members. You're going to be surrounded by people with a lot of personality disorders. You're going to be surrounded by people who have lived in a community where their community's never really given a fuck about them or doesn't have enough money to even care about them. Or when they do have money, it never really seems to go to them. In TJ's response to this video, he kind of responded back to TJ's response, and he essentially says, you know, I should have communicated better. This is a more looking at it through an ideal society. And this is another problem that liberals have is over idealizing uh, your view in the world. It's not a form of enlightened thinking, and I'm sorry to say this about dark matter, but it's just a bad take. You know, it's very non-pragmatic and shows a severe lack of appreciation for the things that the criminal justice system kind of has done, the actual areas of problems, or maybe he does understand these things, but he didn't just verbalize it well enough. You know, a lot of times, like, yeah, it's a little bit of a cathartic feeling to think about like a child molester and beating the shit out of that child molester. But in actuality, a lot of people really hate child molesters, and in some cases, you know, it could just be simply like a sort of, what am I thinking of? A desire to make an example of somebody. Like, hey, we hate this so much, we want other people to be so discouraged about us. Which, no, that doesn't necessarily work, but at the same time, it is that fear of those actions, it is the fear of the murderers, it is the fear of the rapists, it is the fear of the child molesters that causes such an extreme reaction. You know, most people who end up beating the shit or murdering child molesters in prison, they will tell you, "I have a child, and I can never imagine anything like that happening to my kid, and I want everybody to understand that that will not happen to my kid, and I will find a way to kill you if that ever does happen." That exposure to that extreme action makes it to where you kind of want to have that overreaction as to kind of make up for any lack of control you have over a situation, and that's kind of another reason for punishment that I've noticed kind of goes unmentioned for a lot of these conversations. He also kind of references a sort of extreme isolation model for prisons, which we already kind of have, and it doesn't work. Everything he said about this model, other than having to work to provide for your own standard means of living, uh, sorry, I dropped my pen. Other than having to provide your own means of living and having communication with the staff, uh, it's not. It's just not a feasible model that really makes any sense. Segregation is one of the most controversial topics when it comes to criminal justice today, especially because a lot of times segregation is mostly used for minor rule breaking. But by the same token, how do you establish dangerousness? How do you establish the risk of somebody being around somebody else? Well, again, if you ask jails and prisons and people who used to work at them, they will tell you that they already kind of do this. If somebody goes to jail and they have a charge that is concerning, they try to make sure that nobody knows about it, but they have to try to integrate them with other people. If somebody's extremely mentally ill, that person is at risk for other people to be violent towards them. A sort of controlled chaos of trying to prevent future problems through understanding who the problem people are or who everybody's going to have a problem with. This is a very complex conversation that even professionals end up getting wrong a lot of the time because there is no 100% right answer. And it mostly has to do with how many rooms you have available, what your resources and staffing permit you to do, and how egregious the safety issue really is. When I year 2 years ago, when I quit working at my jail, we had integrated the child molesters to the rest of the community of the jail. But when I first started, they were their own separate housing unit. They had their own, if you had any child molestation or history of child molestation, they were all grouped together because honestly, anybody who found out that you had those charges were going to have a serious problem with them and they were considered to be a higher risk. Very rarely did they actually fight with each other unless if they had some other underlying mental health issues because how are you going to be mad at somebody that has a similar charge as you? This is one of the many issues of how do you decide where people go in a given jail. The most obvious ones is separating by gender, but then that's kind of why so many people get upset at the whole transgender conversation. What do you do when somebody identifies as the other gender, but their genitalia are essentially the same, and you don't want people to have sex with each other? Following too closely is far more dangerous than being shot, being stabbed, or even being in a marriage for that matter. People treat driving like it's walking, and so we don't understand that the ramifications for being a bad driver can oftentimes cause death or great bodily harm. And so, again, even though you have consequences and even though you have a little bit of education, how are you going to fix the problem? Simply saying education is not going to solve that problem. And simply saying that you want to have an idealized society doesn't solve anything because even the most idealized society, we live in an idealized society compared to everybody before us. I think this is kind of indicative to what Hank Green and kind of Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of talk about very regularly is you can know enough about a problem to have an issue with it, but also not know enough to know that people are working on it or there are solutions to those problems. Also, you can know about modern day issues so much so that you don't really understand how many issues have actually been solved. This is kind of the biggest problem that we have with our current society and our current criminal justice problem. Unless if you're okay with cameras being everywhere and all of our privacy constantly being invaded, you're not going to have access to the information to perfectly apply criminal justice. Even in perfect situations, wrong people are still going to get arrested. And a lot of times, what ends up happening is those wrong people that were wrongfully arrested and intentionally wrongfully arrested, and there were bad police officers who just wanted to have an arrest or just wanted to arrest somebody because they didn't like them, they're often lumped with the people who were accidentally arrested, but there was very good reason to arrest them. And so, what you end up happening is you end up having two very extreme responses. The people that like the police want to say, oh, the police never do anything wrong, and you're trying to deliberately misrepresent them, and you can never criticize them, and oh my God, it's such a hard job, which is why I never like those people. Or the liberals that want to burn the whole system down and start over again because they don't, because just punishing the officers or extremely just de incentivizing them or having some sort of a structure put in place to be able to catch that and be proactive, it's there's a reason why everybody's having body cameras right now. Because if you don't have your body camera on right now, people are very suspect to what happened during the arrest. Even the few things that I actually did under the guise of law enforcement, I was told to have my camera on, and if I was accused of anything and I forgot to turn my camera on, people would tell me, "Well, we kind of have to go with whatever they're saying because why didn't you have your camera on?" And again, I think what ends up happening is the marketing of law enforcement makes it to where law enforcement isn't really aware of its own criticisms, just like the marketing of a lot of these ideas that we keep having, the anarchism, where you essentially want to get rid of law enforcement but also still have law enforcement, just call it something else, or you keep saying that you want to reduce harm but you don't really have a whole lot of things put in place and you don't really want to have the rules and you kind of just want to vibe it out a little bit. But you still have prejudice and you still have racism, and you're going to have these things regardless of what system you're going to have. This is one of the primary concerns about discretion that you have is how do you have discretion but still have fairness? How do you have rights and then still reduce harm? How do you punish people and reduce harm? These things I think are way more important conversations than just kind of saying, well, punishment equal bad. Beating the shit out of somebody because they did a thing that you didn't want them to do is bad under most circumstances. However, if somebody's trying to hurt you and you hurt them to stop hurting you, that is a sort of punishment, but it's also a self defense and it's also a reaction. A kid sometimes is not going to understand that a pan is hot and you should not touch it until they fucking touch it. And sometimes that idea of fuck around and find out kind of the way that it's spoken about is basically a sort of ignoring the fact that you can know and educate on every single subject possible, and yet you can still be wrong about something, or you can still not fully understand the consequences of your actions. I hate soldering. Why? Because one, I suck at it, and two, because I'm so not aware of the soldering iron that I'm fucking treating like a goddamn toy that I keep burning myself. And every time I burn myself, I have this hyper awareness about it where I'm still screwing up whatever I'm trying to solder, but I'm gonna make sure I don't burn myself. And then, oh no, I'm actually burning the wood that I'm trying to solder something to. Or I'm trying to, oh no, I accidentally lighted a piece of paper on fire, which really happened because I'm not being safe. And yeah, you can educate somebody on safety, but complacency and laziness are going to take over, and people aren't going to be acting perfectly. But because you have that knowledge of how to act perfectly, you suspect that you're better or more competent than you actually are, and you conflate the results of your actual actions. Again, going back to the driver's paradox, he talked about not even having a speeding ticket or any ticket for that matter as a sort of modern day model citizen. You don't recognize the laws that you break until somebody catches you doing it. And again, the criminal justice infrastructure is made very heavily towards traffic violations, which makes it very impressive that he's 50-ish years old and doesn't have a ticket. It's very hard to do. But a lot of our criminal justice system is geared towards driving violations very badly, uh, theft, and family violence, and a couple of other things too. But we're not going to get into that. But however, even with having an officer on almost every single street, you don't catch most people who have traffic violations. You catch them in the 5% of the 100% of the time that they're driving recklessly, and that's the 5% of the 5% of the time that you're actually watching that person doing it, which is why it's so hard to physically catch people in the act. And again, there's no harm reduction because the only time that there needs to be a harm reduction is when there's an actual crash. But most of the time when you're driving, you're not self-aware of it. This is why a lot of officers will just sit on the side of the road, even if they're not doing their little radar lidar thing, because they know that the moment everybody sees a cop, everybody slows down. The sign isn't doing anything. Now, we can talk about the idealized society, or we can know enough about how other countries have built their roads to basically say, hey, the speed limit kind of matches what the road is built for. Hey, the car companies lobbied for highways and for everybody to have to essentially drive everywhere, and nobody's allowed to walk, and people kind of de-incentivized having buses, which is why we have so many car crashes. You can know about murder, and you can say that the guy that murdered somebody wanted to murder somebody, and the reason why you haven't murdered somebody is simply because you don't want to murder somebody. of the amount of murders that actually happened, how many of those people do you think would say, I wanted to murder that person? Or I want to murder people after they've murdered somebody? Most murderers are like guys who caught their wives cheating on them and they got really pissed off about it. And they would say, yeah, under this circumstances, I wanted to kill that motherfucker because he wronged me. Again, that whole reactivity thing, I know it's a good proactive versus reactive thing, but that's the extreme emotional response to extreme emotional damage. And you could talk about harm reduction, but how do you reduce that harm? You can't even quantify it. And again, unless if you're an actual sociopath or psychopath that places a sort of value on that feeling of taking a life, where like the sort of the serial killer that's described in a lot of cases, you're not really going to find people that wanted to kill somebody. You're going to find people who are in gangs and they feel like they kind of have to, or they feel like they have to establish a sort of dominance because the gang culture is the only real avenue towards success they have found. There's a reason why gangs are mostly in poor areas, and it's because you can't really make a living unless if you're selling drugs, and you can't really sell drugs unless if you have that infrastructure to do so, and most of the infrastructure is gangs. Idealized society or not, these are the issues that come up when you're talking about something as complicated as criminal justice and punishment. The gang member doesn't care about consequences, not because consequences don't necessarily work, but because their lives are so shitty to begin with that they're already risking their lives being in a gang already. Going to prison is not necessarily a downgrade, and in some cases may even be an upgrade to some people who are homeless or in an extremely violent gang culture where that might actually take them out of it a little bit in a slightly more controlled environment, and depending on where you go. And again, it's such a case by case basis that it just is makes it hard to quantify. And I'm not even talking about the reason why so many things in the government are inefficient because everything is contracted out. Everything is quoted at a certain price and it ends up costing more in the long run anyway. Or people are trying to profit off of the extra surplus of money, so they try to do things with the cheapest materials, the least amount of people, in the least amount of time possible. All of these things that are so easy to throw out when you're thinking in perfect ideological fashion. And again, a lot of this goes back towards like the Christian and American violence. You know, like why are some Christians so okay with violence? Because they feel like if they feel threatened with the idea of not having that cultural dominance, so they want to force that cultural dominance. Or why is America so violent? Because they want to have that international dominance. You know, I that's kind of the main reason why. Like the biggest thing. Uh, that is the biggest problem for us is as a species is the reduction and the tribalism that kind of comes in, and it's so easy to be tribalistic when it comes to people who have done something wrong. It bothers me because just like me, he's an atheist and he kind of has that argument. He throws in that argument randomly when Christians ask him like, well, if you don't believe in God, why don't you murder people? And he goes, because I don't want to. And I understand that he understands, and what he's trying to communicate is under better circumstances, most people wouldn't want to. And that's what he's trying to say. But when you're so bad at verbalizing it, and when you're that ignorant on what the current system advertises itself as, it makes it to where you're either speaking to people who know more about it, and I believe I do a little bit when it comes to this stuff, or you're speaking to people who already support it, so it kind of just falls on a lot of deaf ears. And again, it's this weird intellectual flexing where mistakes and shortcomings aren't tolerated, so we can't acknowledge where things are done correctly. And I will go even a step further where the diagnosis ends up becoming the problem. You know, to say that the problem with our criminal justice system is because of wanting to punish versus wanting to rehabilitate or wanting to be proactive instead of reactive, however the fuck you want to phrase it. I would venture to say that a bigger problem is the fact that there's only consequences for things that are easy and for people who don't already have power, as well as a highly inequitable society, as well as the fact that it's just wherever the infrastructure takes you. A business can have cameras all over the place and catch somebody taking a Snickers off of the wall. And they can call the cops and they can have all the evidence that the cops need and lead to a very easy arrest with an easily identifiable photograph where they can easily find somebody, or that person may already be detained by that company's loss prevention, and then that person gets arrested, and they have this structure already put in place for the civil lawsuit and the fines and laws that make it easier for them to financially charge them more money than the cost of that Snickers bar, because they're also allowed to charge them money for the staffing. But if you work at a job, there's also laws put into place that make it to where even though you can be illegally fired, your boss can fire you for any reason. And then we wonder why employee circumstances and employee rights dissipate and why people are so miserable at their jobs. You can say equitable society, more equitable society, but again, and I think he already kind of admitted this when he said, I needed to communicate that better. I don't think it's necessarily that you need to communicate it better. I think it's more just a rudimentary understanding with a lot of intelligence kind of backed into it, leading you to a overly simplified conclusion that doesn't really help anything. And again, a lot of it comes from a sort of perception too. Like law enforcement is very easily disliked right now, but if you talk to in private as a law enforcement officer to an older law enforcement officer, they will tell you that, it used to be so much easier. We used to beat the shit out of people all the time, and now we have to have cameras everywhere and we have to behave 24/7. The complaints and the higher standards and the community's reaction has already led to many improvements. And again, while their credibility keeps going down because ICE keeps acting under the guise of law enforcement, and the conservative law enforcement likes to associate itself with ICE, so that way, whenever ICE does something bad, they kind of get that flack. It makes it to where it's hard to acknowledge the improvement, and when it's politicized so much and so heavily, or when it's overly idealized, it makes it. I think that's what kind of is making it hard for dark matter to really be able to verbally communicate these ideas. Again, this is a world I lived in until I physically did not want to do it anymore. Some of the bestest and nicest people that I've ever met were criminals. Some of them were violent. So I think I want to offer a better explanation of Dark Matter's opinions that I don't necessarily disagree with, but I do agree with TJ that it wasn't communicated well, and that I think this would be a better summarization. That instead of his personal anecdote, I will give you a personal anecdote of a real situation that happened with me that I think would be better indicative. So a long time ago, uh, when I was a corporal, there was a guy who was a mess. He was an emotional mess, constantly getting into arguments, constantly having issues. He got into trouble. I can't remember what he got into trouble for. He may have gotten into a fight. Well, for whatever reason, he was separated from the rest of the inmates. We called it desegregation, uh, most commonly known as solitary confinement, where everything extra that you're allowed to have is taken away. You're not allowed to call family. You're only allowed to call your attorney if you want to talk to your family, because we had to legally provide them a means to contact with communicate with the outside. You would be allowed to write letters, is what you were allowed to do. Uh, and from the outside, it was very easy to label this guy as nothing more than a problem that was just going to be a problem every time we interacted with him. And one day, he's kicking the door, and I'm the supervisor, so I asked the area to address it. And they said that he was upset because he wasn't being let out of his cell. The rule that we had, because there were 16 people, up to 16 people in this area, we didn't have necessarily the time to give them multiple free times. We would give them 1 hour a day. That was the minimum that we were allowed to give them. We would offer that to them. If they said no at any point in time, we often told them they would refuse for the entire day. So what ended up happening, because we would come on night shift, the day shift would just ask everybody in the morning, and even though they were asleep, and people half awake would just say, "I don't want to go out right now. Can I go out later?" Some of the officers were really shitty, and they would just log that as a refusal for the whole day. And it turns out all day they let out two people out of the 10 to 16, and later problems would emerge, and it wouldn't be clearly communicated to the individual that refusing right then and there would be a refusal for the day, or even if it was clearly communicated, they may still get upset about it. Now, I go up there to talk to this person. Mind you, I'm pretty sure I've already had a use of force with this guy by this point in time. And he went from kicking the door like he normally did to eventually taking a step back and saying, "Can I have just like a normal conversation with you?" And I said, "Yes." He was a little bit more redneck, so I'm going to make him sound a little bit smarter than he actually sounded, but I'm going to summarize it in my own words. But he basically asked me, he said, I was never told that I would not be allowed to come out later. I thought I would. I don't even remember them asking me. I was asleep, and I don't even think they woke me up. They didn't make sure I was awake. I don't remember being offered. And I asked him, I said, if I look at their body cam footage, would I be able to see this? He goes, I promise you. He goes, unless if I was asleep, so tired that I don't remember saying no, like I'm pretty sure. I said, okay, I'll check. And I said, as a matter of fact, I looked back on it and realized they never even went to his door, unless if they were feeding him. And there was no camera footage of them even offering it to this guy. So I went up to him and I said, well, they didn't even document that you refused it, let alone had any camera footage of you telling them no. So I told him he could come out. And then he asked me this really big question that really made me realize a lot of the problems in the facility that I worked in and a lot of the problems with criminal justice in general. The guy looked at me and he said, and mind you, he was a redneck. He wasn't he not just a redneck. He was a redneck, multiple felon, probably personality disorder, mentally ill guy who you might be able to have somewhat of a conversation with, but very emotionally volatile and in a really really sober state of mind. He goes, "Why do I have to act out to be listened to?" And I think that made me realize that this is somebody who every time he's ever had a problem, he was only ever looked at as a problem. And because of that, force was very often used on him, and he was kind of just written off as an asshole most of the time. And if he just felt like he was at least somewhat listened to, he would learn to be a little bit more reasonable about it. And so the response of punishing or de incentivizing an action made it to where he got more pissed off and reacted more harshly, which made us, it was a negative feedback loop. Because by the time they get to somebody and they have an issue that needs to be addressed, and the moment they can have it addressed, the person that's working at the store doesn't realize how many automated voice messaging systems they've had, how many other coworkers that have already talked to them that have been lazy and didn't even give them an appropriate answer, how many times that they were told that they could do something and then later they found out it wasn't the case. Uh, some of them are assholes and they know that if they act out they'll get what they want, and that's basically the behavior that is being responded to. And that's the sort of reactivity that I can understand dark matter having a problem with, is being so reactive that it kind of has a sort of behavioral response pattern of people thinking that if they act a certain way they can get what they want and not realizing that they're just causing harm. So I guess in the end of this video, I have a very brief way of phrasing what dark matter was trying to communicate while being, would like to believe, a little bit more informative about some of these topics. As a matter of fact, I even wrote this in my book, Life is Hard When You Were Stupid. It was either that or the book, Work Faster and Slower, Why You Probably Hate Your Boss. And in actuality, it's very similar to when I worked at that jail and I was only ever spoken to by the supervisors whenever we did something wrong. And it was basically, if I only know when I do something wrong and I never know when I do something right, what does that say about the environment? And I think when he talks about the idealized society, when people aren't desperate, and when people don't feel a desperate need to acquire their goods or acquire their survival mode, whatever they need to survive whatever circumstances they have, you're going to be met with a lot less violence when it comes to a lot of these things, which is why it's important for resources to go towards people who need it the most. My dad, when I was a kid, we needed to have groceries. And I remember he didn't have the money for those groceries. He didn't want to make us eat very simple and cheap food. He wanted us to feel like we still had a normal life. And at one point in time, he wrote a check that he wasn't sure that he could pay. And he was very worried about it. And he was like, if I have to go to jail to feed my kids, that's what I'm going to do. But he ended up finding a way to make the money to pay for it. In a lot of our politics, we have people who go on national television and say that they want people more hungry and more desperate, either not realizing or not caring that that's just going to lead to more violence. A lot of times we talk about ending the war on drugs, but you don't really go to rehab unless if your options are either rehab or prison. And because we don't just offer rehab to people, or because rehab is privatized and mostly just a weird kind of private church thing, it's just this kind of really expensive option you have to avoid a even worse outcome. And I think it's best summarized by saying that if you want to avoid problems, you have to make the solution more appealing